the kinds of progress that we're making, sometimes I find myself wondering, I wonder why that is we're doing so well. Because it's very hard to get media coverage. We're issuing a thoughtful, well-researched press release on the order of several times a week, often more than once a day, depending on what issues are out in front of us. Very rarely do we see those in the pages of the newspaper. You can learn a lot about what's going on in the world actually just by constantly referring to the Green Party website, because so many of the issues that we're addressing are simply not turning up anywhere in the mainstream media. I think to myself, why is it that we keep doing so much better? Frank Graves of ECOS he does a poll a week. One of my favorites, I have to say, was when Katie O'Malley described that week as constituting Maymentum. That was the CBC analysis, because we were just growing everywhere. But one of the things that the pollsters did recently was they're also struggling to figure out, why is the Green Party doing so well? And Frank Graves at ECOS thought maybe everybody's default vote for essentially none of the above. So to test out that particular theory, he thought he'd get rid of our bloated polling numbers by giving the people in the public opinion polls a choice of saying green and then, or none of the above. So there was a small realignment that occurred with that, but it was tiny, and our vote continued to grow. And I think the reason that so many people are turning to the Green Party and that we are routinely now polling across Canada in the range of 11 to 14%. In my riding and in Adrian's, we're both running, as you know, in British Columbia, where we're polling as much as 18 to 24% of the vote across the province. And in my own riding at 33%, which is in a dead tie with the incumbent Gary Lunn. So we're doing extremely well. Yes. But yeah, especially But I think the reason we're doing well is that we're offering voters something that they desperately want, which is hope. They desperately want, against all the odds, against the sense of growing cynicism about our politics and the despicable behavior of many different political parties and many politicians, they actually look at the Greens and think, that's where I can put some trust. Because Green Party candidates across the country, people like Randy and people like Natalie and like Leah and like Brett, you look across the country and these are clearly people who are committing themselves to something difficult. Running for office is difficult. You put yourself out there and it's a lot of hard work and you're really being judged in a way. But the people who are putting themselves out there to do that are recognized by the average Canadian as motivated by a commitment to the public good, motivated by a commitment to community. And, as anyone who decides to run for office in the Green Party of Canada because they're power hungry, well, you have to wonder what their frame of reference was to make that decision. So right now, and I hope for forever, the people who are putting themselves forward as candidates for Greens are a very fine group of people. And what it means for Canadians to have people you can believe in political life is not to be underestimated. I just last night had a small community meeting that we sponsored in Fort McMurray. The riding in Canada, Wood Buffalo riding, with the lowest voter turnout of any riding in the country. 72% of the people in that riding didn't vote last time. The federal election in 2008, only 59% of Canadians voted. So these are very worrying trends. To me, this is more fundamental even than the question of do you vote Liberal or Conservative or NDP or Green. The most fundamental thing is, do you vote? Now, some of you will remember the frou-frou recently, which I think was a bit of an artificial media spin, that there were big efforts underway for the opposition parties to merge. I had to wonder about Wendy Mesley's judgment going on national CBC television to explain that she had evidence that there were high-level negotiations at the highest level of the parties, she said, but Jack Layton and Michael Ignatieff weren't involved. I thought at some point she might have wanted to check her notes. But anyway, that particular effort led to some media people calling me. Are the Greens involved in merger talks? Are we interested in a merger? And I said, absolutely. We are dedicated to merging with the 41% of Canadians who didn't vote last time. Yeah. That's our merger target. You find people at the door who are saying, oh, I don't know about you Greens, you split the vote. I'm not quite sure what vote they're talking about. The big problem in Canada isn't vote splitting, it's vote abandoning. And if we could get to the root of that problem, and I think the root of that problem is comes directly from the kind of cynicism that comes from a politic of constant electioneering in the absence of governing. That's what we see in Ottawa today. And within 12 months, virtually, we had something unprecedented happen. Now, it's been a while now, and maybe voters will forget about prorogations. But it's worth noting, we don't, in this country, elect a prime minister. We seem to think we do. The media seems to tell us we just did every time an election is over. In our system of government, we elect 308 members of parliament, and they can decide how they organize themselves. They could actually be completely constitutional for 308 MPs at the end of the 2008 election. They could have assembled in Ottawa and looked at each other and said, you know, do any of us really like Stephen? Is he the right one, really? Is he a good team player? Is he going to, you know? There's nothing about our Constitution that would have made it wrong or illegal for 308 MPs to pick somebody else. The reason it doesn't happen is not the Constitution of Canada or even the rules of Westminster parliamentary democracy. The reason that didn't happen or even enter anyone's head as an idea was because of the internal rules that govern political parties. The political party rules say that we elect a leader, and of course I was elected leader, but the political party rules also say, well, if you have the most seats, if the expectation is that the person who's leader of your party, and the increased power of political parties, it's really quite anti-democratic. The internal structure of political parties, the more they become centralized, the more they become top-down, which I think you'll all agree, any of you who've worked in the Green Party, you can back me up on this one. We're not that party. We are grassroots. We're the last thing from top down. But the Liberals, the NDP, and the Conservatives have organized themselves now in a way that's extremely top down. So in the whole world of Westminster parliamentary governments, and when you look around the world to say, in terms of top down, in terms of autocratic, are there some measurements to see how we rate versus the other countries? At the time of the prorogation, it was New Year's Eve. I'm sure all of you would remember that, of course, that's a typical time for a government of Canada to make a major policy announcement, is on New Year's Eve, in hopes that all Canadians will notice it. That particular announcement led to a study by an Institute for Parliamentary Governance at Imperial College in London, England. Historically, when have Westminster parliamentary democracy governments chosen to shut down the House of Commons for reasons of political expediency? This is a key thing to remember, for reasons of political expediency. Because the normal routine of our parliaments is you have a speech from the throne at the beginning of a session, that sets out a legislative agenda. At some point you complete that agenda, begin to run out of things that you've promised to do, so it's a reset button. You shut it down, you start over, and you have a new speech from the throne. But to shut down the House of Commons to avoid a confidence vote you know you're going to lose, to avoid unpleasant or embarrassing inquiries into documentation of the Afghan detainee issue. Where across the Commonwealth of Westminster parliamentary democracies has this been done? And the answer from this one study was it has happened only 3 times in all the history of Westminster parliamentary democracies, and all 3 times were Canada. The first was Sir John A. Macdonald to avoid the Pacific scandal. But the censure which he endured for doing that was so severe that when he reconvened Parliament, he immediately resigned and there was an election. The other 2 were both Stephen Harper. So you look at this question of prorogation and say, what did that mean about the state of our democracy, that we could allow that this could happen? Now, a lot of Canadians became concerned, especially the second time, because there began to be a sense that this is undermining fundamental democracy. And that, I think, is a message that when we go forward in the next election campaign, probably even more central to what we talk about than the climate crisis, or more central to what we talk about than what are we going to do to pay attention to pension reform? What are we going to do to create the green jobs, to stimulate the economy? I think the fundamental piece that's going to run through everything we talk about in the next election is, how do we save Canadian democracy before it's too late? How do we restore a sense of respect in the House of Commons, that the 308 MPs who are elected are treated with respect when they're there, treat others with respect, and set aside the constant partisanship, which is right now at the level of something toxic in the House of Commons, to say, what can we do together? How can we work together? What better decisions could we reach if we tried to find common ground? And that's why having Greens elected in the House of Commons, no matter what our numbers, whether we are 1 or 4 or 6 the first time out, we're going to make a huge difference. Because our approach is going to be to prove to Canadians that it's not too late to save democracy. That it really does matter who gets elected. And that it really does matter how you conduct yourself. And whether you think it doesn't, to have a House of Commons and a question period where the conduct is so far below the bar of civility that you really, sometimes I watch the question period and think this is, any day now they're going to add a parental warning. You will not want your children to watch what follows here. How do we make sure that when we're there, everything changes? And that's a big part of our green traditions that we can draw on that are international. Again, a lot of Canadians don't quite know how many Greens around the world have already created the policies that have led to the European Union, for instance, being ahead of their Kyoto targets, having cut greenhouse gases more and at the same time found ways to stimulate their economy at the same time, how the gap between the wealthiest and the most poor hasn't been increasing in the way it has in North America, in those countries where Greens have been in government. We've seen Greens in coalition governments in Germany and in Sweden and currently in Ireland, as well as in Norway and in New Zealand, in France. Greens have been part of functioning governments, and many, many Greens have been in parliaments and legislatures all around the world. We are numerous in Brazil, for instance, and in the next Brazilian presidential election, Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil's former Minister of Environment, Marina da Silva, who is herself daughter of a rubber tapper from the Brazilian Amazon and a great champion for fighting to protect the Amazon. She quit Lula's cabinet when he wasn't protecting the rainforest, and she's now running as president for Brazil for the Green Party. This is the kind of thing that's happening right around the world, and the most exciting development for us in Canada, getting back to the kind of democracy we have here and how to give people reason to have hope. There's 3 countries in the world that still use the archaic system of first past the post. And we know it's because of the first past the post system that we could, in this country in 2008, Greens got just under 1 million votes. We set a new record. I don't know how many of you know this. This is the kind of record I didn't want to set. That we're the party that's achieved historically the highest number of votes and yet not elected someone. It's not done. You know, we're not going to do that again. We're going to do the highest number of votes and elect people. But it's fascinating when you look at the numbers that we could have gotten close to 1 million votes. Our vote went up when general voter turnout went down. Every other party's vote dropped, including the Conservative Party's vote. Their vote in numbers of people who put an X next to a Conservative candidate's name dropped, yet they won more seats. Well, it's because of the nature of this perverse first-past-the-post system that we could get almost 1 million votes and no seats. The Bloc Québécois, in contrast, got 1.3 million votes. Not that much more than us, except they got 49 seats. So the first-past-the-post system, for those of you who fought election after election for the Greens, it's been seen, some people say, well, you know, we won't get to Parliament until we change the voting system. And that's not true. And now we know it's not true. And we know it's not true because Carolyn Lucas, the leader of the UK Green Party, in a first-past-the-post system, just won her seat in the British elections. And so she's proven it can be done. We could get as much as 15% of the vote in every riding across Canada and still not elect anyone if our vote was evenly distributed right across the board. So the decision was taken that we were going to target and really make a huge effort to get the person who'd gotten the best vote in previous campaigns to run in the place where there was a greater likelihood that people in that community really wanted to elect the first Green MP. So that's why the riding of Saanich Gulf Islands came to the top of the list through quite a lot of good polling and so on. And that's moved to Saanich Gulf Islands just about a year ago. And it's totally true. This is a community somewhat like Brighton Pavilion, that within the UK, people would say, oh yes, that's the kind of thing Brighton would do, right? So that's the way people are going to be about Saanich Gulf Islands. Oh yes, Saanich Gulf Islands, that's just the kind of thing they would do. But once we make that breakthrough, we can break through across the country in riding after riding. And going back to where I started, why are we doing so well? Because we're giving Canadians hope. We're talking about the kind of world we want And we're underpinning that with the most sensible, down-to-earth policies possible that look at the world as it is and say, we know what we must do to have a livable world for our kids and our grandkids. The status quo and continuing on the path we're on is not an option. Can't keep doing what we're doing. And just in the same way that we can't keep doing what we're doing in terms of addiction to fossil fuels and expect to see a different result, and we can't keep doing what we're doing in terms of cronyism and casino capitalism, that's not going to be a path that's sustainable. That's just waiting for the next big bubble to burst. So while the people who have the big chips to put on the gambling tables just bet against themselves on hedge funds, the people who suffered down the end of the line are the people who never had the money to buy the chips in the first place. And in that same way, we can't keep doing the same thing we've always done and expect democracy to be different. It's not going to help to vote for the Conservatives or the Liberals or the NDP and expect anything to be different. The only way to get the change we want is going to be to persuade everyone we know, not just to get to the polls, and that's really important. Start talking to people now. Find out who among your friends, and it'll surprise you, didn't vote in the last election. Odds are that someone you think of as being so reasonable, responsible, holds down a good job, well-educated, all that kind of stuff, you'll be surprised. You'll find some people that you never would have guessed had decided not to vote last time. So we've got to get people to vote, and we've got to give them that opportunity to say, this time when you cast your vote, you're going to feel really good about it. Because this time what you're doing is you're voting for your own future, you're voting for your children's future, and you're voting to ensure that this country of Canada continues to have and restores a functioning democracy focused on the values that really make us Canadian. Respect and love for each other, support for each other in community, an assurance that we never let the most vulnerable sink between the cracks, and that when we make the decisions of how we treat this planet, we treat it as if we plan to stay.
Yeah, I am over 18, but I have been here, and I have been here for 15 and a half years, but only in March this year did I become a citizen, so I have a vote. My naive question is, what are you going to tell me, as leader of the Green Party, I should know as for my first voting opportunity in Canada that makes Green stand out from all the rest?
The thing that will make us totally different from other parties now, and I would like to see other parties be more like us, but the bottom line is that we're looking forward. All of our policies are looking forward for what it means for 7 generations out. We are not allowing the short-term discounting against the future to dominate our decisions about the economy, about the environment, about our infrastructure, about our society, about our communities. All of our policies are focused on what's meaningful in the long term. And that focus, we are also, unlike any other party, aware that we can't have unending economic growth, that there's limits to growth, and we have to live within the limits of an ecosystem. We can't just continue to operate as though there are no limits, and that there's an imaginary world in which we can continue to exploit our resources beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. Other parties will never talk like that. I can tell you that there are individuals who are fine people. So I'm not going to say that we're the honest ones. As a party, we're really ethical, we're really honest, we have strong values. But I think too much of some of the poor souls who are actually MPs now, working within other parties, who are still struggling as individuals in every single party. That's one of the advantages. I can't wait till when I'm elected, because I'm confident that we can start working across party lines, forming nonpartisan caucus work in our own effort to address environment, to address issues of youth unemployment, and to do these things together. So I know there's good people in every single other party, but you're not going to find another party that's principles are as firmly rooted in we're here to do what really matters, not just to make us look good or to spin or to pitch or to sell. We're here for fundamental change that we desperately need. Very mainstream small c or big C conservative publications like The Economist increasingly are mentioning, I don't know how to put this other than say that we're acting in ways that are distinctly out of character. And this is something certainly that I hear in international meetings, certainly in international climate meetings. You know, people look at you as if there's some great tragedy, and it is a great tragedy. Well, they'll say, well, What's happened to Canada? It's as if you went to high school with somebody and you go to a high school reunion and the student that used to get the straight A's and everyone looked up to is now jailed for pedophilia. You'd look at them and say, what happened to George? The Economist has taken us to task. They actually had an editorial criticizing the Prime Minister's prorogation. It's very distinctly anti-democratic, how we've handled ourselves on climate, but on other issues as well. The decision that the Harper government made to say that funding for maternal health couldn't include access to abortions in countries where they are legal. That one also got an editorial condemning us from the British medical journal, The Lancet. That's quite unusual for Lancet to write an editorial about the position of a foreign government. Stephen Harper's role at the G8 and G20 was not one where he scored loads of points with the other world leaders, nor with the world media. Specifically on the abortion issue and maternal health package, he had to be dragged kicking and screaming into allowing climate on the agenda for the G20. There was a lot of pressure from Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, from Felipe Calderon. I never thought I'd live to see the day that Canada's environmental record would be held up to shame in the House of Commons by the President of Mexico. Right? Right? He came to visit us and he said, what are you doing? You know, because Mexico's a Kyoto party. And here's Canada, the only country that ratified Kyoto that has violated its commitments. The costs of the summit. How many of you saw Nicolas Sarkozy answering the question? France is hosting next year. And they said, so what are you going to spend on the summit? Are you going to spend? And he laughed and said, basically, he said, probably a lot less than 10% of what this one cost. The other thing that a lot of Canadians didn't find out from our media, I don't know, maybe you have all heard this, but I think it's fairly shocking. The G20 summit was already planned for 2010. It's in South Korea in November. Stephen Harper added an extra meeting on so that he could have the G8 and the G20 back to back. And he made this decision and then dragged the G20 leaders there. So we can hope that when the real G20 summit happens in November, they actually make progress on the issues where they didn't make progress in Toronto. Because the deficit pledges are not really very solid. And if we hit another economic downturn, which happened, I mean, the stock market took a huge plunge the day after the summit. I don't think those things were related. But world leaders are not about to pull the plug on stimulus spending and go full bore into deficit reduction when they're still trying to figure out how do we ensure that we have economic recovery before we start starving the system of, right now priming the pump may still be needed a little bit more. And each world leader said, we'll have to judge by our own circumstances. And Harper got in the way of, there was tremendous support from, certainly from France and Great Britain for something that we support as Greens, which is the Tobin tax. He kept that from coming forward. I don't know how many of you heard that at the summit, Canada executed an agreement with India that according to another wonderful Albertan, the Honourable Doug Roach, who was our former ambassador for disarmament, actually means that Canada has violated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement by making a commitment to sell nuclear technology to India. So we had a lot of things come out of that summit. I don't see Stephen Harper as wearing a mantle of leadership globally. I do see him as pretending he wears a mantle of leadership globally for a Canadian audience during the next election. And we'll just have to be very, very careful to keep pointing out what it really looked like. I think the fact that there will be inquiries within Toronto on how this summit security was organized will be important. And I think it's going to be a long time before Canadians forget the fake lake. The Direct Energy building, where they were putting all the media, while the G8 leaders went up to Huntsville, they sequestered the media in Toronto with this fake lake inside a building. If you actually stepped outside that building, you're on the shores of Lake Ontario. Who knows why Canadians had the costs that we had and the pork barreling associated with that G20. The meetings ended up costing the taxpayers $50 million an hour. We ended up pledging to the women of developing countries who need help with maternal health care a generous donation, sure, but it was slightly less than we just spent for 4 days worth of meetings. So keep perspective on all these things. I think that we'll have more that will come out before the election so that Harper can't make those claims. Well, he can make any claims he wants. Stephen Harper says that Canada now is playing a more relevant role in the world. Since the 1950s or 60s, Canada's reputation globally has never been at such a low ebb. I can't speak to what it was like before that, but it certainly is at a very low ebb now.
One of the reasons why our minority parliament can't function effectively is the committee system that is being actively sabotaged by the Conservatives in such a way that if they don't like a witness, they would try everything possible to block that witness, and if they can't, they vacate. The committee has to shut down. So they really can freeze committee work in its tracks. How can having 1 or 2 or 3 Green people in there change it so that our democratic system can work?
An excellent question, and it is uniquely during the period in which Stephen Harper has been Prime Minister that this kind of abuse of committees, we used to, even if things were partisan in question period, you always knew that when MPs went into a standing committee to look at legislation, it was as if you checked your partisanship at the door. People rolled up their sleeves, got to work, and you often saw parties have all-party reports out of committees. Harper's added another element of destroying committee work, and that is his insistence that he can decree that members of his staff can ignore subpoenas from House of Commons. This is quite amazing. They had it on As It Happens for the record at some point. John Baird yelling point of order, point of order, point of order over the chair of the committee till they couldn't hear themselves think. This democratic deficit issue is the way I'd want to frame it when we're in the House. To address the democratic deficit, we need to make sure that the rules of committees allow the majority of MPs to elect their own chair, to have good process and good procedure. Now, in a minority parliament situation, this does mean that the chair would not necessarily be of the Conservative Party. Might be, if someone knew that a certain MP was very fair-minded. I think of Michael Chung, for instance. I don't know how many, I wrote a blog about this if any of you want to go back and try to Google, search the Green Party website for the name Michael Chung. I don't think I've referred to him all that often. He's actually got a motion before the House for better and civil behavior in question period. I think if I were on a parliamentary committee and Michael Chung was a possible chair, it wouldn't matter to me that he's Conservative. I would trust him to be a good and fair and impartial chair. So it's not always going to be the case that electing the chair means it's not a Conservative. But if the MPs in the room elect their chair at the beginning of the session, we can avoid that abuse. It's been really, really bad. And of course, once we're able to change the culture in the House of Commons at question period, if we can dial it down so that question period is actually respectful and people hear themselves think, I think that will change the culture of the whole thing. I don't think they'll be able to get away with abusive treatment in committees. I'm going to do zero tolerance for heckling. And that's going to be the issue on which I hold firm. And it's not just, I talked to Preston Manning about this, and he said, oh, we tried that, and we didn't heckle, and pretty soon we had to give up because we didn't get any media coverage because we weren't heckling. And I've talked to MPs like Carolyn Bennett of the Liberal Party. She says, oh, well, she got elected. She's a medical doctor. She said, I was absolutely committed to never heckling, but now she heckles. The mistake they've made, and I don't blame them for it, I've thought a lot about this. Okay, my plan, my simple plan. It's against the rules of the House of Commons to interrupt someone when they're speaking. That's actually against the rules. Zero tolerance for heckling doesn't work if you just say, I'm not going to heckle. I have to make sure nobody heckles me. So when I stand to speak, and this is another phenomenon I've noticed, particularly for women, if somebody's heckling, the tendency, human nature, is to raise the volume in your voice so you can be heard over the yelling, which is particularly unfortunate for women because it makes you sound, unfortunately, yeah, Leah's nodding, it makes you sound shrill, kind of hysterical, kind of like Sheila Copps on a bad day. So what I'm going to do is different. If someone interrupts me, I'm going to sit down. When the person asking the question feels that they must sit down, the speaker will stand up and call for order. But say that doesn't work, and I miss my question once or twice, I might not get any coverage for a while, and I'm not going to get a question a day until we have a caucus of 12 MPs and have official party status, which will happen someday. But I think the media will start covering it. Once we create something like just a foothold for public concern about civility in the House. Right now, if someone's disgusted with question period, they're disgusted with everybody. You know, it's a plague on all your houses. All the parties seem awful. They're behaving like schoolyard bullies. So there's no traction for Canadian citizen engagement to insist on civility and respect in question period. I think if I make that tipping point symbolic, iconic, this is what we're going to do first, and sometimes they may interrupt in the future, but they're not going to interrupt me, and I think Canadians are going to say from coast to coast, she's right. We don't want people yelling. We don't want the abuse. We want people to wait and hear each other's turns the way you do when you're civilized. I think it'll work, and I think that'll affect the committees as well.
When you came to debate oil sands, tar sands development in Calgary, you set up sort of an expectation on what would be acceptable. You said you have to have certain return on energy efficiency. Some nuclear technologies that I think are quite promising, traveling wave reactor, liquid fluoride thorium reactor. I know that our policy is very simple to understand, no nuclear. Is there more nuance demanded there because it might be that eventually concerns about nuclear energy can be addressed with future technologies?
Since the Greens have a policy against nuclear energy, would we ever reconsider with some of the new technologies which are being discussed but don't yet exist? I guess the answer is of course. If Greens globally found some reason to reassess nuclear, but the hierarchy of technologies that Greens want to see used to replace fossil fuels over the long haul, first thing you want to do is make sure that all of your decisions are economically rational. That may surprise you as being the first thing that Greens want to do, but you only have a limited amount of money. You want to reduce greenhouse gases, so you want to apply the dollars in ways that reduce greenhouse gases the most while creating the most employment possible for that investment, for quick returns. If that's your first goal, what you want to do is improve productivity with which we use energy. So right now Canadians waste more energy than we use. We waste 60% of all the energy that's used in Canada, and that's because of inefficient building and transportation design. Our infrastructure was designed for cheap and abundant energy, so no surprise, there's lots and lots of waste. So that's the first thing you do, is you reduce the waste. Then during the time that you've got for lead up, you start diversifying to renewables. When you look through the whole hierarchy of choices and options that we have, and we have a long list of options that work quite well, nuclear energy is down the list because in current fission reactors, you've got a tremendous long lead time to build the thing. It only produces one kind of power or electricity. It's not terribly reliable. It's hugely expensive capital cost, very few jobs created, and it only produces electricity. And it's about 14 years from when you put the project forward to when it's built, and it's famous for cost overruns. I didn't even mention in that the risk of accidents, long-lived nuclear waste that have to be kept out of the biosphere for a quarter of a million years, the risk of nuclear proliferation for use in military terms. You don't even have to look at those issues for nuclear to fail. Now, whether there are new technologies that are worth looking at, sure, when and if they exist, but people have looked at breeder reactors and gotten excited about that as if it would make things better, and you can believe it. The nuclear industry is going to promote breeder reactors as though they're somehow recycling waste. They're much more dangerous because the core of the reactor itself is plutonium. So you've actually got, whereas with conventional reactors such as the CANDU, which is natural uranium and heavy water, or the US reactors, which are light water but enriched uranium, neither of those kinds of reactors can blow up. You move to this wonderful new technology that recycles nuclear waste, you have that risk of critical mass because the core of the reactor is plutonium. So it'll take, if there's something comes along that we're always looking because we're practical. If something, an exciting technology that we were once against because it's of problems that are solved, we'll look at it again.
You mentioned that the Conservative government, the Harper government, was going to gut the EIA process.
Yeah.
And they've labeled it as streamlining the process.
I've worked on Canadian environmental assessment since I was in government, and in 1987 worked with the team in the Environment Department to go to Privy Council office for permission to legislate. So I've been working on this for a really long time, since we used to have something called the Environmental Assessment Review Process, which was a guidelines order. Every government since the late 1970s has worked to develop a coherent, structured program that was predictable. There's been a lot of work done since the Environmental Assessment Act came in. Amendments that dealt with the complaint that somehow there was duplication between federal and provincial levels of government. That's been dealt with. There's now joint federal-provincial panels. There's an avoidance of duplication. There's a decision that projects either go a comprehensive study route or they go to panel reviews. So a lot of those complaints that the environmental assessment process delayed projects, they're not demonstrated. There's no empirical evidence for it. It's rhetoric. What they are doing under the budget implementation bill, and there's several different steps that they're taking. One is to remove all energy projects from the Environmental Assessment Act, full stop. So if you're looking at offshore oil and gas, which people are quite concerned about in the wake of, not the wake, we're still in the BP oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. Those would not have an environmental assessment under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. They would have a review under one of the regulatory agencies. for offshore oil. A nuclear reactor wouldn't have an environmental assessment under SEIA. It would go to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and so on. That's one piece that they're doing. The next piece they're doing is, if anything, worse. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled in February on a case that, it takes a while for cases to get all the way to the Supreme Court. It was called the Red Chris Mine. It was an open pit copper and gold mine in northern BC, and the Minister of Environment was found by the Supreme Court to have violated the terms of the Environmental Assessment Act by looking at this great big mine and deciding, as DFO often wants to do, to scope it down. The scoping process defines the size of what you're going to examine. And in scoping the Red Chris mine, the Minister of Environment had decided to look only at tailing ponds and a couple of ancillary things, not the mine itself. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. Under the Environmental Assessment Act, you must look at the whole project for its cumulative impacts. So what they're doing in the law right now is saying a Minister of Environment can scope a project any way he or she wants. You can have a great big mine and you can assess a tiny little bridge. Permanent changes to the Act. They also, of course, put in that if it was an infrastructure grant with federal money, there's no EA. That's fairly temporary because the infrastructure money is going to end. They've also reduced the access to public participation and consultation in comprehensive study reviews. All of these things taken together, I use the word gut with a fair degree of confidence that they're destroying the environmental assessment process in this country, and it is not streamlining. In fact, I think it might even take longer because they've conveyed some of these things now to agencies that have no expertise and haven't ever done them before, and expect the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission or the National Energy Board to run an environmental assessment process. If those boards and regulatory authorities take their responsibility seriously, at least in the ramp-up period, it could take longer. Because SEIA is very efficient, and the project reviews don't take a long time unless the proponent delays them. In the case of the Mackenzie gas pipeline, by the way, a lot of the delays were due to Imperial Oil. They were very slow putting forward their documentation, et cetera. So probably too long an answer. Sorry about that. Thanks. And yes, way back there.
Getting that attention in the House of Commons by being able to ask questions. But it seems to me an equally important exposure type would be the opportunity to participate in those panels that CDC, CTV, CPAC have. In the House of Commons, you're one of 308. On those panels, you're one of 5, so your impact is significantly greater, I would think. Plus, you're talking to the Canadian public, not to the House of Commons.
So I go to question period whenever I'm in Ottawa. Now, I'm in Ottawa a whole lot less living in British Columbia than when I was in Ottawa from Nova Scotia. But I have a reserved section in the diplomatic gallery, so I have a place to watch question period, be in the same spot every time. But when question period is over, I'm not allowed in the lobby outside. I can stand behind sort of like an invisible, it's sort of like Les Nessman's office, if anyone remembers WK, right? There's a place I can't go across. And what it means is that you're quite right, getting that access to those pundit panels. Here we are running, polling at over 12, 13% in national polls, and you have all those panels of people talking about issues, and they don't include Greens. Once I'm elected, once any Green is elected, they're going to have to include Greens on those panels. It's going to make a huge difference. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm excited about that part. I'm excited about everything. Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll take this one too. And you're next, anyway. Ron.
Yeah, there was a draft I saw a year ago of this streamlining of the environmental assessments that removed right in navigation to any waterway that wasn't less than 1 meter at low water, which would be 99% of the flowing water in Alberta. Is that still in place?
They did that last year in the budget bill. The question was about changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. What happened in 2009, that's the first time Stephen Harper realized he could push unpalatable things down the throats of parliamentarians by putting them in the budget bill. So the 2009 budget removed the rights of women in the federal civil service to pay equity, raised the limits before you'd have to review a foreign takeover of a Canadian corporation, and by the Foreign Investment Review Board wouldn't have to look at any sale that was under $1 billion. And the third thing was to say Canada Navigable Waters Protection Act had been unchanged in this respect since 1867, which is that the definition of navigable was, can you get a boat down it, even a canoe? The new definition of navigable is whatever the Minister of Transport says it is, without criteria. So that's been changed, and it's having an effect in certain projects, but it's a permanent change to the act that they put through last year.
I'm an urban designer by trade and a community activist, and I'm getting into city politics because I realize we have to make some significant changes to policy at all three levels of government if we're going to make our cities become the human scale, engines of prosperity and environmentally sensitive places that they need to be. I'd be very interested to just hear an overview of the Green Party's urban policy and offer, if I can in any way contribute to developing a platform, I would be honored to.
For any of our policies, if people don't know this, if you go to our website and click on policy, then you find a document called Vision Green. It's now up to 150 pages because we try to deal with all the issues that a federal government should deal with and how we see the problem, what solutions we think would work, and how we go at them. On the issues of municipal infrastructure, which we think are critical, and municipal funding, the municipal level of government, as you would know, is basically the place where most Canadians experience their government. And I sometimes say, if the federal government went on strike, how would you know? When they forgot to ask you for your taxes. But if the municipal government goes on strike, your garbage doesn't get picked up, your recycling doesn't get picked up, the water could be a problem, your buses might not run. Municipal governments have to carry a tremendous load of services to the public, but they're only able to access 8% of the total tax base. So municipal governments need to have predictable, stable, secure funding from the federal government, and the downsizing and downloading on provinces and municipalities has created a really huge gap. So what we have is a commitment to predictable, secure funding to municipalities. We've costed it out in terms of where it would come from. It's in 5 critical areas: improving mass transportation, improving, and that includes access to cycling, improving recreational areas, remediating brownfield sites so we can liberate billions of dollars worth of real estate that's in all of the municipal areas across Canada, and of course the water infrastructure. We have a deteriorating waterworks in just about every community, and it needs huge levels of investment. So we'd be providing, and we've allocated how you do that over time. If it wasn't for the hiking of HST in Ontario and BC this year and the recessionary impacts, we would have been dedicating 1% of GST in a GST increase to go to municipalities. But this year is not a good time to do that, so we found the funds elsewhere through the federal system to be sure that we're able to well, the gas tax is just, not the 8 cents on the gas going to municipalities is already there. We want to up that so that municipalities have access to the kind of resources they need. Oh, and I forgot the 5th one. Sorry, I knew I forgot one. Low-income housing. The federal government needs to make a commitment to municipalities to assist with low-income housing.
When you talk to people, what turns around a Canadian with voting rights who doesn't bother?
I don't think anything is as effective as explaining to people that it does matter that you vote. I was speaking to a group in Peterborough, Ontario not long ago, where after I spoke, a woman stood up and she was in her mid-40s. It was a really startling declaration. She said, "I've never voted before because I never thought it mattered until tonight." So when you start explaining to people that if even half the people who chose not to vote in 2008 had voted, the election result would have been different. And the other thing I find that's very persuasive is a lot of people have stopped voting. It's almost funny how often I hear people say, well, I've decided it just encourages them. So it's not that they're not voting because they're apathetic or they're lazy or they don't care. They're not voting because they're angry with the political leadership that they're getting. They're angry at political parties. And when I explain, that when you don't vote, you are rewarding the politician whose actions were deliberately taken to discourage you from voting. You're only abdicating your own power in the situation to make a statement about the future you want. When people realize that there actually are politicians who hope they're not going to vote, that tends to turn around at least some voters. I have a wonderful canvasser in Saanich Gulf Islands who's developed this thing. When he knocks on a door and someone says, yeah, no, I don't vote. He says, great, you're just who I've been looking for. Because it's so important. It's so hard to find the people who don't vote. And you're the key to changing the whole system. You say, oh. The key thing is voting is powerful. And staying home is just rewarding the people who essentially don't want a democracy. I was on Sunday Edition with Michael Enright, I guess it's not, and Jim Travers from the Toronto Star, who's a wonderful columnist. Is Elizabeth exaggerating? What do you think, Jim? And he said, oh, no. He's not exaggerating at all. He said, as a matter of fact, what we have in Ottawa today is really a democracy theme park. All the buildings are there, and it looks like it might once have been a democracy, but it's not a democracy anymore. And I thought that, you know, there's ways of reaching people. And I really am serious. We've got to save it before it's too late, because if these trends continue, you know, which are connected to oil wealth and connected to the fact that the money isn't being set aside as Peter Lougheed had intended it to be set aside. We've allowed our dollar to become a petrodollar, and petrostates have a pretty predictable process of erosion of democracy and people's sense of empowerment in their community to make decisions. So if we don't act fast, we could just slide into a place that we won't recognize as Canada.
Why are we one of the very last countries in the entire world? I've traveled in Spain and France with my son, and we got around just fine and dandy on the railroad.
It's not that we don't have the technology. Canadian taxpayers have done a lot to support Bombardier. And Bombardier has one of the most competitive, successful technologies for high-speed rail. You were probably on a Bombardier train in Spain, and in China, they're building, you know, some people say, oh, well, Europe are tiny little countries, that's why they can do it. Well, how about China? They're the same kind of, you know, length and breadth of the country will be spanned by trains that go, and some of these high-speed trains, they go 500 kilometers an hour. So they're competitive in terms of the time that's spent with air travel, where a lot less greenhouse gases, and a huge economic development potential. So we do have a commitment to investing in rail modernization year on year. Barack Obama, by the way, put $13 billion in their stimulus package into high-speed rail. And I think our transportation critic, by the way, is another one of our Alberta candidates who's not here tonight because he runs up in Vegreville. His name's Will Munsey, and he actually is a train engineer. He actually works on the railroads all the livelong day. And he is a great transportation critic and spokesperson for us on our rail policies. So talk it up in the election. I've never met a crowd of Canadians yet who don't get excited about the idea of having better, more efficient, accessible train service.
A lot of the people I talk to are about 15 years behind. When we're talking about the Green Party, they think environment first. How can we turn that and have them see that it's environment and economics and push that economic side of our policy more?
My brother thinks a great convincer is the speech I gave here last time that's on our website. And he's directing people all the time because I gave a talk about green economics in this room. And it's all on YouTube and people can watch that. But I think it comes down to this, is really explaining to people that, of course, survival is a rather important issue. I mean, if we are going to be a single-issue party, I think survival is a good issue. But we're not a single-issue party, and that's the key message to get out to people, is that do you think you're interested, if you don't think the Greens have a good economic policy, have some responsibility. Did you know that the Greens are the only party that's actually gone to the parliamentary budget officer and tabled figures for how we would approach and fight the deficit? We've actually tabled with the parliamentary budget officer how we would reduce EI premiums to the employers that have to pay them and to employees that have them clawed back at a time that Harper and Flaherty are planning to hike those in a very significant way that could really hurt employment in Canada and actually hurt the recovery from recession. So our economic policies are more fiscally prudent and practical than those of this government, which has dragged us into a $56 billion deficit. It's not easy. It's a kind of a one-on-one conversation, because I can proclaim till I'm, you know, green in the face that we're not a one-issue party, but people don't necessarily believe us till we start engaging them in that conversation. The leaders' debate, I think, was one of the best chances we had to do that, because so many people told me afterwards that they thought I would be good on the environment, but they didn't realize the Greens had such sensible policies on all the issues. Green agenda is not just an environment agenda. It's fundamentally an economic revolution that creates more jobs and creates a healthier and more competitive economy that isn't so subject to the fluctuations of the petrodollar, that isn't so much at risk from the casino capitalism of the gambling and the booms and the busts, but a long-term steady state economy as a plan is much more economically secure than the current system we're in. We'll just have to keep explaining it.
A lot of our policy talks about fair trade, not free trade, and possible ratification of NAFTA or removal of it.
You need to know that we've basically got belts and suspenders at the same time, because our trade with the U.S. is governed by two different agreements, at least. One is the overarching global general agreement on tariffs and trade, which was created around the time post-war, again, when people realized that, you know, post-Second World War was when most of global institutions, with the notion of we want to make it a better world, rebuild after the Second World War. So, you know, believe it or not, there were idealistic impulses behind creating the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, as they're called, and also the GATT started at the same time. Now, what Canada did in the Mulroney years was decide that the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which rules against unfair tariff barriers, so the U.S. couldn't be prejudicial towards us in trade under the GATT rules, but we negotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement to further consolidate what was essentially U.S. powers in this, this continent. The pieces of NAFTA that don't work for Canada, and I'll just mention them quickly, which is why we want to renegotiate NAFTA, and maybe to get the U.S.'s attention to renegotiate NAFTA, we have to say 6 months to get out. Some people panic and say, well, if you're going to get out of NAFTA, all our trade's going to collapse. No, you've still got the GATT, okay? That's why I started with that piece. The energy chapter of NAFTA makes no sense for Canadians. In a three-party agreement of Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, Canada is the only country that committed that in selling our energy to the U.S., no mention of Mexico, whatever proportion of our energy we sell to the U.S., we must maintain in perpetuity. So if we're selling right now about 60% of all the natural gas that we export to the U.S., we must continue, no matter how much natural gas we have, even when we start running out, we will always have to sell the U.S. 60%. In exchange for this quite extraordinary commitment, we got nothing in return. Mexico didn't make a similar commitment. It's just a unilateral, weird thing that apparently Canadian negotiators put forward. Okay, so that piece should be renegotiated. The other one that's really bad is called Chapter 11, Investor State Provisions, which say that if a foreign corporation feels that its expectation of profits have been affected by a rule in Canada, or say a this applies to Mexico, U.S., and Canada. So if a Canadian corporation feels aggrieved by something done in the U.S., the Canadian corporation can sue the U.S. government. But in most of these instances, it's U.S. companies. This is quite bizarre. Just wrap your mind around this. This is the first time in the history of democratic societies that we have given individual corporations that are foreign from our soil the right to sue governments in a way that a domestic corporation could not. Right? And we've said that they are investors even if they've never built anything in Canada or owned anything in Canada. If they see Canada as a market from which they will make money, and Canada changes at the level of municipal, provincial, or federal rulings, anything that reduces a U.S. company's profit expectations, they can sue. And as a result of this, we've already seen laws passed in Canada repealed to accommodate U.S. corporations. So that should be removed. And we need to make sure that we have across Canada a bill that says that we are never going to allow water, in bulk water, to be a good in trade. So that's kind of our trade policies are very sensible, and we've spent a lot of time developing them. Anyway, I see a lot of people looking steamy and wilting, and so I think I'll let you get going. Best of luck on the campaign trail to Randy and to Brett, and I think Natalie probably had to go because she had the baby. Thank you all for being here.
And what more is there to say but thank you everyone for coming, and feel free to mingle and chat for a few more minutes.